I'm happy to be here, and it's a great privilege to be involved in this conference on synodality. My writing and my work here is about servant leadership in terms of what is the leadership that the clergy, in particular the hierarchy, can offer in terms of synodality. I think that we need to be engaging the bishops more clearly on the question of synodality and asking what type of leadership we want to see from them. Unfortunately, the past 25 years, we keep asking, what do we want for the formation of our priest? And we don't ask the question, what do we want for the formation of our bishops? The formation of our bishops happens very differently from the formation of our priests. Here at this conference last night, we heard 3 papers, all on the formation of seminarians. I think this is a very important issue. But the people who make the decisions, the people who lead the church, are the bishops. And we have to engage the bishops much more clearly and much more with a better focus. I, myself, propose that we actually recognize that there are different cultures, and the culture of clericalism, that is a vicious culture that really hurts and affects seminarians and priests as much as the entire church, that similarly the hierarchy has a culture that I call hierarchicalism that actually hurts the bishops and hurts the church. And I think it's time now, finally, that we're beginning to pay attention through synodality, that if we want leadership, we need a leadership that's formed to be servants, formed to be humble, formed to be hospitable, welcoming the Spirit in our presence. One of the main issues that I think when we hear theologians talking about the role of the Spirit is people will say it's a Spirit calling to listen. Well, what qualities do we want to have in order to listen? I would suggest that there are 2 qualities that you need. One is humility and one is hospitality. And what I think of when I think of synodality, I think of one place. It's the upper room. It's in the upper room where Jesus decides on the night before he's to die that he takes his disciples there, and he wants at the Last Supper to welcome them to a new form of ministry. And he begins that ministry by stripping down and washing their feet. He's going to be teaching them a new lesson of leadership and of love. And it's there in the upper room that he will teach that lesson by, if you will, literally washing the feet of each of his disciples. Even Peter will feel so awkward, and Jesus will insist that it has to happen. The disciples are so affected by the upper room, by the washing of the feet and the breaking of the bread, that after the death of Jesus, it's there in the upper room that they continue to return day in and day out after the death of Jesus. And I think that if one wants to talk about synodality, we should focus in on the upper room because it is there that the Spirit descended. The disciples, after the death of Jesus, continuously return to the upper room, presumably to grieve. But in that shared grieving, they begin to understand more and more that there's a presence of the Spirit that has come into their midst and is hospitably welcoming them to come back day in and day out about their grieving. And they're learning about the love of Jesus, and they learn so much about the love of Jesus that Jesus returns to the upper room and meets them in the upper room and welcomes them by signs of peace and by trying to help them to understand things. His leadership in that upper room, before his death and after his death, is a sign of what true humility and what true hospitality actually is. It's then at the Pentecost that after 40 days, the disciples have been gathering there in the upper room where they've been grieving, where they've now recognized the risen Lord, that they then leave the upper room. They're able to leave it, and they're able to go out and begin preaching. They begin preaching in such a way that they start welcoming people, welcoming them into the circle of Jesus. They begin doing this first to the Jews, but in times they're led by the Spirit to be hospitable not only to the Jews but to the Gentiles. And it will be in the celebration of the Pentecost that they will be able to welcome even more. Hospitality is always the sign of the Spirit. Humility is always the sign of the presence of the Spirit. If we want to talk about what servant leadership is, we need to put some virtues to them. I would suggest that the virtues are humility and hospitality, because that's what the disciples learned in the upper room, where the Spirit first made herself present to the disciples in terms of the presence of Jesus and the guidance of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, if we want to ask questions about how should women, how should younger people, how should older people, how should lay people, all sorts of, the issue is how hospitable is the church? How welcoming is the church? Is the church a sign of the way that Jesus would welcome when Jesus would tell the disciples whenever they wanted to send the people home, no, find some food for them, find some other way, but welcome, hospitality, that's the measure of Jesus, it's clearly the measure of the Spirit. And therefore, when we're talking about people in the church, we shouldn't be asking questions like this. If we're asking questions, how do we welcome women? This is 2023. The church shouldn't be asking this question. It was, after all, Mary Magdalene who's the first one who's charged with giving the ministry to announce that Jesus has been raised from the dead. It's Mary, the mother of Jesus, who's in the upper room. The presence of women in the early church, no one asked, what is the role of women in the church in the upper room? There was, they knew they were mostly men, but they also recognized that Mary is in their presence, and that Mary Magdalene returns there and makes reports constantly about what's happening. We have these things. So asking questions about what's the role of women in the church, you have to say that there's something alienating going on in the church if you can't recognize that the issue is really welcome and that they have a place in the church. We're asking this question because they're having a difficulty in finding their place in the church. Young people are finding that they don't know whether they're welcomed or not. People who are talking about their own self-understanding in terms of gender identity and other matters, they're really struggling with this. Where's the church's hospitality? That's what you learn. That's what the disciples learned in the upper room. Hospitality and humility. A humility because they were so struck by what they were invited to do. A new form of leadership that's actually about letting go and about trying to understand people's needs so that we can respond to them. We can only respond to them if we let them speak. So one of the issues that I have on formation, as I said earlier, we have all these programs on seminary formation. I find this really fascinating. You can I've seen any number of groups of theologians and others form groups to propose seminary formation. Then they send it, then the bishop says, that's fine, I'll leave it here. The entire question is not about seminary formation, it's about the formation of our bishops. Are our bishops on board? One of the questions that people may have is, why did it take so long to get a synodal church? If synodality is the mark of the Second Vatican Council, why are we talking about it now as something new, so many years after the council? And we have to say, well, who's been leading the church after the council? The bishops. Is it priests? I would not say. I would say that many priests do not think of themselves as leaders in the church. I think most of us who are priests think of our bishops as our leaders of the church. Why hasn't that happened? That's why we're asking these questions. And we cannot say that a synodal church is being welcomed right now very easily. We see that the synodal church is being welcomed by some bishops, but also by many that they're not. And this question is that we have a pope who's really endorsing synodality. We saw even today, after the death of Cardinal Pell, a denouncement of Pope Francis's leadership. There's plenty of ways that if we want to ask, what is the challenge to synodality in the church? We have an expression in English that simply says there's an elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the leadership that our bishops provide. Are our bishops involved in the work of the Second Vatican Council in putting forth the synod and in understanding that synodality is a new way of servant leadership? Who will be most affected by synodality? Women? Sure. Men? Sure. Younger people? Sure. People with sexual identity issues? Sure. But more than anybody, the bishops. When synodality comes in, it will be transformative also for the bishops. Maybe they will have that experience in the upper room where grieving, by understanding what real loss is, or real call, or real vocation is, that there in an upper room experience, they will encounter the Spirit that will lead them through humility and hospitality to see what servant leadership is. So it strikes me that there are two questions that we have. One would be a cultural change, and one would be an institutional change. And I'm right now looking at cultural change. And I would say that the problem that we have right now is we have a culture, which I call hierarchicalism, in which our bishops really are in an older form of leadership model in which they just decide, and that they have singular prerogatives. And it has nothing to do with real communal or real theological argument about what is the role of the bishop of this place. It is more about a development that we've seen in the church from the 19th century that really imprisons the bishop, but also the diocese in the ways that people exercise. How does this actually become more humane, more spirit-led, more transformative? I would say the first thing is we have to recognize this culture. That's what I think that we're misled by clericalism, and we keep thinking all the issue is about seminary formation. I'm trying to say that there needs to be attentiveness to bishops and to the formation of bishops. I had the privilege several times, about 3 or 4 times, of teaching in Rome. I also did my advanced degrees, my license and doctorate in Rome at the Gregorian University, and I taught at the Gregorian 3 times. And there you see the men who are being groomed to become bishops. Their training to become bishops or to have leadership is very different from a seminary in the United States. The houses of formation that you have in Rome are very, very different in terms of whether you go to the Germanicum, you go to these different places. Those institutional changes that I would like to see would be actually that we should not be sending men to Rome to become bishops. We should be making sure that they grow in grace, they grow in humility, they grow in hospitality in their own place. The church will only be led well when it's a little less Romanized and a little bit more of their own native culture, that people can somehow testify to the experiences of their people, and not an anonymous people, but the real people of the real issues of the place that they're from. One of the things that we always say about a bishop is a bishop of this place. His formation should be in that place, and it should not be in another place, an international place that since the 19th century has captured the way we form our bishops. We need a new model, and the new model has to be by attending to the place where we need bishops to come from. I think what synodality would do is give hope to people who are trying to stay. I think that's the biggest issue, is that I think that the people of God are looking for a reason to stay because they've watched so many people leave. And they need some sign of hope. And I think that synodality suggests that the church is trying to listen, trying to be hospitable, trying to say to people, please stay. Or as could be suggested, please come back. Please know that you're welcomed. The church where I preside, I preside at a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right nearby where my university is. They read out a statement in the beginning of the first Sunday of every month. All people are welcomed here, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation. They go through a whole list of reasons that people may not feel, they could feel alienated, and say you are welcomed. It's just a simple welcome. It's a way of the church trying to be hospitable. I think synodality as a process would be calling us to a mindfulness, a new mindfulness of welcome, a new mindfulness of listening, a new mindfulness of servant leadership that's based on humility, that I'm really overwhelmed that I've been invited to do this type of ministry. I think that the main issue is listening. I mean, synodality always talks about listening. I'm trying to say listening, I could be here, you could be talking away, and I could be saying I'm listening. Well, listening is an interiority thing. That's why I'm saying that we need virtues of hospitality and humility. that somehow I am receptive and capable of it. I use a word vulnerable. Vulnerability, when we talk about vulnerability today, we don't mean a weak person or a precarious person. We mean a person that's capable of being wounded, one who's so open and responsive to another that they're vulnerable. So the Good Samaritan is the one who's vulnerable to the man who's wounded on the road. The father of the prodigal son is the one who's vulnerable to his returning son, and also to his resentful son who wants to go away. We need a notion of vulnerability that really animates the leadership of our church. And I think that's what constitutes real listening. I see the people who speak out and say on transgender issues, oh, we're not going to be involved in this, have not listened. Something happens when you're invited to listen. I'll just give you one experience that I had. About 28, 30 years ago, I got a call in Cambridge from a therapist who said, I work with transgender trans people. This is 30 years ago. I didn't even know I didn't know much about this issue. And he said, I have Catholics who are transitioning, he said. And I'm afraid that if and many of them who are Catholic want to talk to their priest. And I said, yeah. And he said, yes. And I'm very afraid that if they go to some priest, they're going to be told fire and brimstone that this is all wrong, this is against the church, you can't do this and everything else, and everything will be ruined. And I just want to know, so I've gone around the Boston area asking, is there a priest that I can send, and your name keeps coming up, will you meet them? And I said, okay. You know, I did not put out a sign on this, I just got asked. And then the first person who came in, when I first met the person presented themselves as a man. But the experience I had of listening to this person, I never had an experience like it. Listening has to be transformative. And we can't understand what people are saying. And I'm not saying that everything that everybody's saying is spot on and completely accurate and that's really true and all. But the experience of listening to people about the difficulties and challenges they have, we can't interrupt them, after their first sentence to tell them they're wrong. We have to figure out how we actually take in what people are doing. Listening is an active process, and it requires a conversion within ourselves that I think is based on true hospitality. So I write about this. I've written about this where I've suggested to bishops, why don't you meet some people who are raising these issues? Learn what is going on here. Learn to listen. That's what the Synodal Church is about.